There was a moment when cinema was supposed to die. Not metaphorically, not in the way people say it every few years, but structurally, industrially, creatively. By the late 1950s, film had become predictable, polished and empty. Studios were manufacturing stories the same way factories produce cars: safe, repeatable, profitable. And then, in the middle of that system, a small group of filmmakers declared war on cinema itself. They called it Dogme 95. And they believed the only way to save film was to strip it of everything that made it cinema. To understand why Dogme 95 ever existed, you have to picture European cinema in the 1990s. On one side, Hollywood was dominating globally. Bigger budgets, cleaner images, tighter narratives. On the other, European film was becoming increasingly self-conscious. Stylish, yes, but also distant. Intellectual in a way that often felt detached from real human experience. For some filmmakers, cinema had become too artificial, too controlled, too obsessed with perfection. And that's where Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg enter the story. In 1995, at a film conference in Paris, von Trier did something unusual. Instead of presenting a film, he handed out a manifesto, a printed declaration almost like a religious text. It was called Dogme 95, the Vows of Chastity, and it read less like filmmaking advice and more like set of commandments. The rules were radical: no artificial lighting, no props that weren't already on location, no genre film, no superficial action, no murders, no weapons, no music unless it exists within the scene, and most importantly, the camera must be handheld. In other words, everything that cinema has spent decades perfecting was now forbidden. The idea was simple but extreme. Remove all technical manipulation and what remains is truth. Or at least something closer to it. But Dogme 95 wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a philosophical attack. Von Trier and Vinterberg believed that directors had become obsessed with control, with shaping reality instead of capturing it, with creating illusions instead of confronting something real. By imposing limitations, they were trying to force filmmakers into honesty. It almost paradoxical. By restricting freedom, they believed they couldn't rediscover authenticity, and for a moment it worked. The first major Dogme film, Festen or The Celebration, came out in 1998. Shot with handheld camera, natural lighting and almost no production design, it looked raw, sometimes even uncomfortable to watch. But that's exactly the point. The film follows a family gathering that slowly unravels into something deeply disturbing. And because there's no cinematic distance, no polished lighting, no controlled framing, you feel like you're trapped inside the room with them. At one point, a character delivers a speech that cuts through the entire film like a knife. The truth is, you're all pretending. The line doesn't just apply to the family, it applies to cinema itself. Another key film, The Idiots, directed by von Trier, pushed the concept even further. It follows a group of people who deliberately act idiotic in public as a way of reflecting social norms. The film is chaotic, uncomfortable and often deliberately provocative. But beneath the chaos is a clear intention: to expose how much of everyday life is performance. In a way, Dogme 95 wasn't just criticizing cinema, it was criticizing society. The idea was that we are all acting, performing roles, hiding behind structure, and that maybe cinema had become just another mask. But here's where things get strange. Dogme 95 positioned itself almost like a cult. Filmmakers had to submit their films for certification. They received an official Dogme number like members of a secret order. The manifesto itself was treated almost like scripture, and yet many of its own founders broke the rules. Von Trier himself admitted the violation of the Vows of Chastity in his films. Hidden lightning, manipulated sound, small cheats. Which raised an interesting question. Was Dogme 95 ever really about the rules, or was it about forcing filmmakers, an audience, to question what cinema actually is? Because even in breaking its own rules, Dogme 95 achieved something important. It shifted attention away from technical perfection and back towards storytelling, performance and emotional truth. It remembered filmmakers that limitations can be powerful. You see echoes of it today everywhere. In handheld realism, in modern dramas, in the rise of low-budget independent films, even in the stripped-back aesthetic of some streaming-era productions. The idea that you don't need massive resources to create something meaningful that's very Dogme. And yet, the movement didn't last. By the early 2000s, Dogme 95 had largely dissolved. The strict rules became less relevant. The cult faded. But maybe that was always the point. Dogme wasn't meant to become the new standard. It was meant to disrupt the existing one. To shock cinema out of complacency. To remind it that rules are temporary and that every generation has to redefine what film can be. And this is where it becomes relevant again. Because if you look at cinema today, you can feel a similar tension between algorithm-driven content and artistic risk, between global streaming platforms and local cultural identity, between polished spectacle and something more raw, more human. The same question is still here. What is cinema supposed to be? If you're interested in this kind of stories, the movement, the ideas, the hidden philosophies behind film, this channel is exactly about that. So if you haven't already, subscribe. Because we are going to explore cinema not just as entertainment, but as a cultural force that constantly reinvents itself. Dogme 95 didn't save cinema, at least not in any permanent way. But it did something more interesting. It proved that cinema doesn't need saving in the way we think. It needs to be challenged, broken, rebuilt, over and over again. And sometimes it takes a strange little cult to remind us of that.